Just let everyone know. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, well, this is the good part though. So we didn't miss anything. This is the good
Maybe
part to
just,
start.
yes, if there was anything you need to recap from your first sentence.
Absolutely. No, this is the good part to our panelists. Just talking a little bit more about what WFN is, again, a coalition, an alliance of women's funds and gender justice funders. We've been around for next year will be our 40th anniversary. And again, we're really excited to partner with CEDAW and all these wonderful partners because of the fact that our members, women's funds have been collecting data at the local level for the past 4 decades, and the ability to have another lens, another tool to which to turn the data into action, into policy that leads that can provide examples and move more cities to adopt these conventions. Again, this is something that's really, really exciting for us and for our members. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and move to our first panelist, Mary Hansel. She's an international human rights lawyer, legal scholar, and member of Cities for CEDAW Advisory Board. She is an accomplished legal scholar specializing in international human rights law. She currently, her current research explores the potential legal and normative implications of the U.S. Equal Rights Amendment in comparison to those of the UN Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW. Mary, thank you so much for being here. I hope that you can share with our participants, ground us a little bit in CEDAW and the movement to pass the local CEDAW-based legislation in the U.S. and collect data around such legislation. I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Sarah and Elizabeth for the invitation to speak with you all today. I think my slides are up. There we go. My name is Mary Hansel. I'm an international human rights attorney and scholar focused on intersectional gender justice and the application of human rights standards to the U.S. at all levels of government. I'm currently a member of the advisory committee for the CEDAW movement. I proposed and worked on LA County's CEDAW ordinance, and I consulted on San Diego's CEDAW ordinance. In my allotted time, I'm going to cover 2 main topics. First, I thought I'd start off by providing some background information about CEDAW and an example of key guidance from the UN CEDAW Committee on Gender Data Collection. Then I'll move on to local CEDAW implementation in the US, referred to as Cities for CEDAW, for those who may not be as familiar, and the local provisions on data, highlighting the need for intersectional approaches and privacy safeguards. My hope is that I can get through some basic information that will help set the stage for the other panel presentations in the Q&A. So what is CEDAW and what does it say about data collection? The UN Convention to eliminate, oh, next slide, please. During the pandemic, as I was teaching, I got very into slide transitions. So you'll see some very creative ones in this slideshow. The UN Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, known as CEDAW, is a core international human rights treaty and the principal legal instrument for ensuring gender-based rights across the globe. CEDAW was adopted by the UN in 1979 and went into effect in 1981. The rights enshrined in CEDAW promote gender justice in every area of life. That's civil, political, economic, social, and cultural. These rights apply through an intersectional lens, which recognizes a broad range of intersecting identities, including those related to race, gender identity, gender expression, migration status, disability status, and socioeconomic status. Notably, CEDAW is more intersectional, recognizing more intersecting identities than US law. In addition to setting forth substantive rights, CEDAW establishes an oversight body called the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, referred to as the CEDAW Committee. The CEDAW Committee issues authoritative interpretations of the treaty, focused recommendations to member governments following periodic reviews, and quasi-judicial decisions on complaints alleging treaty violations. These interpretive statements, targeted recommendations, and case decisions give detailed meaning to the text of the treaty. They also ensure that the treaty's provisions remain dynamic, keeping pace with evolving gender discourses. So when you read the text of CEDAW, which again was drafted in 1979, it may seem out of date and a bit of an anachronism. It doesn't seem on its face relevant to today's discourses regarding gender, but the treaty is made a living instrument relevant to contemporary societies through the ongoing continuous guidance provided by the CEDAW Committee, somewhat similar to how the US Constitution is made a living document relevant to contemporary society through the ongoing guidance provided by the US Supreme Court. Although one could argue that the current Supreme Court is more regressive than contemporary, especially with respect to gender justice. The CEDAW Committee has emphasized the importance of gender data collection and analysis for devising policies and protocols to address gender inequalities and for assessing how well these policies and protocols work. The CEDAW Committee has also provided extensive guidance on the data collection process in various contexts. So for example, next slide, please. In its general recommendation number 35, which was issued in 2017, the CEDAW Committee addressed data collection in the gender-based violence context, calling on governments at every level, so it's not just the federal government, to, and I'll read the quote, establish a system to regularly collect, analyze, and publish statistical data on the number of complaints about all forms of gender-based violence against women, including technology-mediated violence, the number and type of orders of protection issued, the rates of dismissal and withdrawal of complaints, prosecution and conviction, and the amount of time taken for the disposal of cases. All data should be disaggregated by type of violence, relationship between the victim survivor and the perpetrator, and in relation to intersecting forms of discrimination against women and other relevant socio-demographic characteristics, including the age of the victim survivor. So as referenced here, the CEDAW Committee has made clear that the data collection and analysis should be intersectional. And the committee has also explained that data collection must be subject to stringent policy, separately, the committee has explained that data collection must be subject to stringent privacy safeguards. So that's just one example of how the CEDAW Committee has really emphasized the need to collect data with respect to various gender justice issues. Next slide, please. So now how does CEDAW apply to those of us in the United States? CEDAW has been ratified by every country in the world except for 6: Iran, Sudan, Somalia, Palau, Tonga, and unfortunately the US. To become party to a treaty, the US government needs to both sign and ratify the instrument. President Carter was a strong supporter of CEDAW and actually signed it in 1980. But decades later, we still haven't ratified it. Under the US Constitution, a 2/3 Senate vote is needed to ratify it, which means that a bipartisan vote would be needed, which of course has gotten harder and harder to secure in today's polarized political society. There have been 3 ratification attempts in the Senate. If you read the Senate debates about ratification, you'll see a strong sense of American exceptionalism. This idea that the US doesn't need this treaty because we're already so advanced in our gender equity that we don't need or want to be told what to do by a UN body. In response to the US's failure to ratify the treaty, grassroots advocates have focused on passing local measures that embody the key principles of CEDAW while simultaneously addressing salient issues facing individual jurisdictions. Indeed, a grassroots movement, as I mentioned, referred to as Cities for CEDAW, has coalesced around the adoption of these measures. Local governments have now passed more than 40 CEDAW resolutions and more than a dozen CEDAW ordinances, which of course are binding. These measures have brought about remarkable strides in gender justice, as a number of scholars who have examined their results have concluded. One quick sidebar in terms of how the Cities for CEDAW movement relates to the broader campaign for the US to ratify CEDAW, the treaty. Even if the US does, by some miracle, ratify CEDAW, we will still likely need this local movement to promote implementation. This is because when the US ratifies human rights treaties, it attaches what are called RUDs, an acronym for reservations, understandings, and declarations. And these RUDs are sort of caveats, qualifications that a country makes when ratifying a treaty. The US's favorite RUD states that the treaty is non-self-executing, which effectively means that it has no effect unless Congress takes further action. So when the US ratifies human rights treaties, it adds a statement, a RUD, that says, yeah, we agree with this treaty, but it doesn't actually apply to us. So we have every reason to think that the Senate would do the same with CEDAW. So therefore, there would need to be this extra step to promote implementation, even if ratified. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd give two examples of data provisions contained in local CEDAW ordinances, one from Toledo, Ohio, and one from Washington, D.C. The Toledo data provision states as follows: the gender analysis shall include the collection of intersectionally disaggregated data, an evaluation of gender equity in the entity's operations, including its budget allocations, delivery of direct and indirect services, and employment practices, and 3, the entity's integration of human rights principles and the local principles of CEDAW. The Washington, D.C. Provision calls on the city agencies to each collect, quote, data on gender disparities, including data on salaries, job titles, and promotional timelines, disaggregated by sex, race, ethnicity, age, familial status, marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity, immigration status, and disability, provided that data shall be collected, stored, aggregated, and presented in a way that protects any personally identifying information from disclosure. Note that the measures vary in the level of detail set forth regarding the data collection. I think the DC provision is sort of more robust and more descriptive than many of the other local CEDAW provisions. And also note that these provisions require intersectional data collection and analysis. And that's, of course, consistent with CEDAW committee guidance that I mentioned. Note further that only a few of these provisions include privacy safeguards as recommended by the CEDAW committee. I really want to underscore that such safeguards are extremely important at this moment in which state governments are rolling back gender rights at an alarming pace, for example, by criminalizing abortion and using personal data to prosecute women. Thus, going forward, I'd really like to see local CEDAW jurisdictions delineate specific privacy protocols for their data collection in the measures themselves. I would actually love to hear ideas from today's attendees on other ways to best balance the critical need for data with the non-negotiable privacy interests of women, girls, and others with marginalized genders. Next slide, please. Local governments with these measures in place have been implementing these data provisions to varying degrees and without much transparency or accountability. As a result, the Open Data Portal project that my co-panelists will describe aims to bolster this process and identify gender justice issues in need of greater attention. I hope this backdrop has been helpful in framing our discussion on local gender data collection and creating a Cities for CEDAW database. I look forward to your comments and questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Mary. It is an honor and now it's my honor to introduce Dr. Robin Watson-Ellerby, a Chief Strategist Officer at the Institute for Women's Policy Research. Dr. Watson-Ellerby is a seasoned scientist whose research has focused on addressing health disparities that disproportionately impact minority populations. Dr. Watson-Ellerby and the Institute for Women's Policy Research is an important partner to the Women's Funding Network and our local member organizations in their work for collecting and analyzing data and executing research that advances local policy. With that, Dr. Watson-Ellerby, would you like to?
Yes, thank you so much, Elizabeth. Appreciate it. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I don't trust Zoom half of the time, and I worry that the cameras and the technology won't work. But anywho, so as Elizabeth said, my name is Robin Watson-Ellaby, but I want to first begin by thanking the Women's Funding Network for inviting me to be a part of this panel. IWPR is committed to working with WFN and its network of women's funds to develop research and amplify information that will advance gender equity and justice. And I have to admit, it's a pleasure being involved in this session with Ju Marie, Elizabeth, Mary, and Sarah. So thank you. Next slide. The Institute for Women's Policy Research is a Washington, D.C. based research organization, and we have over 30 plus years of experience as a research think tank that is focused on generating the evidence to shape policy solutions that build women's power, close inequality gaps, and improve the economic well-being of families. And our research spans a range of topics from women's economic security, workforce policies, wage gap issue, economic impact of major events like the pandemic, economic impact of state restrictions on women's reproductive health, caregiving, student parents, etc. But focuses on the common thread of promoting economic equity for all women and eliminating barriers across society. IWPR does original research, and that includes quantitative and qualitative research, including generating our own data and analyzing secondary data. We collaborate with like-minded organizations like WFN to combine our strengths and increase our impact. And we partner with other organizations on some different types of research that we may not have internal capacity to do on our own, such as focus groups or opinion polling, to name a few. And relevant to this session, we spend a lot of time thinking about data, about how to improve data collection, how to use data to impact policy, how to address inequalities and biases in research, and the role of data and research in creating change. Next slide, please. At IWPR is grounded in an understanding that data is important, that what we count matters. Data can be critical in helping policymakers understand the scope of a problem. It also is a key in measuring implementation and enforcement of laws and policies. We all know that passing a law isn't enough. To cite one example, today in the United States, we're marking Equal Pay Day. And that's a symbolic day to draw awareness to the wage gap between women and men. And just so you know, in my portion, I'm going to make a lot of references because it's Equal Pay Day. So in the US has Equal Pay Day laws on the books for over 60 years, but the data shows us that pay gaps persist. So, for example, in 2022, women on average were paid 16 cents less for every dollar earned by men. The data on equal pay continues to tell us that more action is necessary. It also tells us where more action is necessary. IWPR produces state-by-state data so we can see where in the country the gaps are the biggest, and so we can push for state-level policy like salary transparency laws or salary history bans that we know help to close the pay gap. The data on equal pay also tells us that not all women experience the issue the same way. Specifically, in 2022, an Asian woman earned 98.6 cents per dollar earned by a white non-Hispanic man. A white non-Hispanic woman earned 80 cents. A Black woman earned 69.1 cents, and Hispanic or Latino woman earned 57.7 cents. So having data, and keep it on this slide, please. Having data underscores the need to do something about it. It gives us tools to talk to policymakers, to show the urgency and the need, and to show where existing interventions are working or falling short. At IWPR, our work is underlined by belief that better data will inform and drive policy solutions. When research institutions like IWPR use comprehensive, valid, and reliable data, policymakers are more confident in the credibility of the recommendations and/or solutions resulting from this data. In addition, for some issues, we find that lack of data creates the sense that the problem doesn't exist or a misunderstanding of the magnitude of the problem. For example, many years ago, IWPR researchers identified post-secondary students who are themselves parents as a key population for which little services exist. When IWPR did more research, we found that this population actually makes up 1 in 5 post-secondary students and is disproportionately women of color. Collecting even basic data made it clear that from both a prevalence perspective and an equity perspective, it was critical for policymakers to prioritize this population. But we still have really limited data on who student parents are, and that leads to limited options for a policy perspective. Most states don't collect their own data on their population, on this population, which makes it hard to target state or local interventions to meet their needs. It's also important to note that for data to be a key driver in policy change, we have to make it relevant to policymakers. We have to connect the dots for policymakers because, let's be honest, they're busy and because they don't spend their whole day thinking about the same things we do as much as we wish they would. We have to make a compelling argument to them about why our data and research matter and give options for how they can use it. A recent example, and you'll see I give lots of examples, that's my thing. It's examples and analogies. So a recent example of this IWPR published research in 2023 on women in manufacturing jobs. Our research was about opportunities and limitations for women in the industry and didn't have explicit ties to policy. We thought it'd be hard to engage policymakers on this issue, but we made it directly relevant to Congress by holding a briefing where we talked about using federal infrastructure spending to promote gender equity. And we had over 90 staffers turn up for the briefing. So this was definitely something that we consider a success. Next slide, please. Oh, I think we order. Let's see. We should be on slide data gaps. If we could go there, that'd be great. There you go. Thank you. As a research institution, we're always looking for good sources of gender data at all levels, national, state, local. IWPR does work primarily at the national and state level, and thankfully in the United States, extensive administrative data is collected, like healthcare records, social programs, tax systems. I think we need to mute our microphone. Thank you. What was I saying? Oh, so I was talking about administrative data. So I mentioned healthcare records, social programs, tax systems, census data, and more. And they're gathered and collected at various governmental levels. However, we primarily use national and state level data because of the issue of data availability. On some issues, even to get state level data remains a challenge. It's one of the reasons we really welcome our ongoing partnership with the Women's Funding Network and why we're excited to keep partnering with Women's Funds and others who are working at the state and local level. Coordination and dissemination of gender data remains a major challenge, one that I'm hoping this new data portal can help ease. From the research end, there are times when we know data is available, but we have to go to extraordinary lengths to get it. So like in preparing for this panel, I was speaking with my team, and one of my team members brought up an example, an instance where when we were collecting data for our Status of Women in the States dashboard on violence and safety, that in order to get the data we needed, our team had to call various police departments across the country. There are also some conflicting challenges in collecting data. So for example, we cannot disaggregate data along demographics that are not collected. This comes up in our work regularly. Policymakers will ask us for data to be disaggregated by sexual orientation and gender identity or immigration status, which we would love to do, or other key aspects of people's identity. This is not possible when that information was not collected as part of the study that generated the data. And this is especially the case when using secondary data. Next slide, please. To the intersectionality slide. So just find it somewhere in there. Hopefully it's in there. Or not. So what I'm going to talk about is why it's important to stay grounded in intersectionality. So tying to the last thing, even though we experience challenges in disaggregated data by diversity, at IWPR, it remains important that our work is grounded in intersectionality. We believe social and economic mobility in the United States is determined and influenced by race, ethnicity, class, gender identity, sexual orientation, geography, and other markers of difference. In working to achieve economic equity and to better understand the experiences of all women in the workforce and in society, we use both racial equity and intersectional frameworks in our research and analysis to help generate strategies and solutions that are grounded in the economic realities of women and families. For example, earlier I mentioned the pay gap that exists between women and men by race and disparity, because it's, equal pay day. However, we need more information beyond the statistic that for example, in 2020, a Black woman earned 69.1 cents per dollar earned by a white non-Hispanic man. We need to know that for Black women, the median annual earnings by state range from just 43.3 cents on the dollar in Louisiana to 71.7 cents on the dollar in Hawaii. We need to know that DC has the largest absolute gap in earnings, with Black women working full-time year-round earning $53,394 a year less than white men. We need to know that based on trends since the 1980s, Black women won't reach pay equity with white men nationally until the year 2144. And we need to know that a number of factors contribute to this pay gap. They include discrimination in recruitment, hiring, and promotion, an increased likelihood of facing sexual harassment, bias, and disrespect at work, the concentration in care and service jobs, which we all know are undervalued, underrepresentation in fields like construction and manufacturing, where there are well-paying jobs that can be accessed without a 4-year degree, and of course, the care crisis. Data show that Black women are more likely than other women to be single parents and sole breadwinners of their families. And unlike other parents, Black mothers' employment has failed to fully recover from the pandemic. So therefore, we incorporate the needs and perspectives of diverse or underrepresented groups into our research designs, because for policies to eliminate or at least alleviate some of the barriers and challenges women face, then it is important to understand their lived experience. And that can only be done through the collection of such data. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Robin. Really appreciate your going through that. And we appreciate our partnership with IWPR for all those reasons that you just mentioned as well. I now want to go to our final panelist today, who is my colleague, Sarah Keyholtz. Sarah is the Director of Data and Strategic Insights at Women's Funding Network. She brings a background in data architecture, development to this work. She is leading this project and this collaboration to build an open data portal in collaboration with the Women's Intercultural Network. On top of that, she's amazing. So I'm really looking forward to having you hear her presentation. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And thank you to Mary and Dr. Robin for your deep expertise in CEDAW, as well as data that advances policy. Next slide, please. So before I get to the specifics of this project, I'm going to tell you about the origin story. The idea for this project originated when one of our board members, June Marie Justice, who started us off today, asked for data on where WFN members were located in the context of where CEDAW ordinances and resolutions had been passed or were in process. Now, we found a wealth of information on the Cities for CEDAW website that Women's Intercultural Network and the folks at Cities for CEDAW Advisory Board have curated. You'll find past ordinances, model ordinances, articles, research, toolkits, one-pagers, reports, you name it. But as someone who is new to the concept of Cities for CEDAW, I found it difficult to find specifically what we needed in a way that we could easily cross-reference with our own data set. Now, we already had infrastructure on the mind. One of our goals is to partner across sectors to build open data infrastructure that increases the accessibility of intersectional data that informs gender-based policy and strategy development. So in this fertile soil, an idea began to take root. Next slide, please. We thought about what if the website contained a filterable knowledge center for finding relevant resources, a machine-readable data set on the status of ordinances and resolutions, as well as a number of other data points for the purpose of identifying trends and developing strategy, which could then be visualized on a dynamic dashboard. And then finally, an open data portal where jurisdictions could publish their own data sets collected as a result of CEDAW requirements. Mary mentioned that CEDAW can be viewed as a data strategy, and where our knowledge center and website will be built in WordPress, over here on the left, we will be building our data portal in CCAN, which stands for the Comprehensive Knowledge Archive Network. And this is an open source data management platform used by governments and NGOs around the world for sharing data. I like to think of it whereas that CCAN is to data what WordPress is to content. So just like how CEDAW ordinances are governed by an oversight committee that evaluates its efficacy, our project will be governed by a data governance committee. And this committee will be made up of stakeholders within the movement. These folks will set privacy policies, determine most useful outputs in terms of indicators and reporting, and ensure that the tool stays relevant as community needs and norms change over time. In the US, our members operate in 38 states, and with about 60% of regional members actively engaged in policy and advocacy work. We know that our members are often coming up against data accessibility issues and data gaps that Robin pointed out, especially at the hyper-local level. And I just want to say pause because I saw some of our members are here today. So hello, Alika, and hello, Chica. One of our members had, and similar anecdote to what Dr. Robin shared, one of our members reported that she needed to call every police department in their county for data on domestic violence because the police departments in the county didn't report out or contribute to national databases. So we see CEDAW as a tool to help close some of these gaps, and we see organizations in our network as potentially valuable members of CEDAW oversight committees, offering perspective on local indicators as well as recommended action plans. And we are still in the development and ideation phase of this project, but I would like to share a bit more about each of the elements. Next slide, please. Okay, so the Knowledge Center. As I mentioned before, the current Cities for CEDAW website has a wealth of information. And what we would like to do here is tag the resources so that they are more easily found. So, for example, what does a coalition that's trying to pass a CEDAW-inspired ordinance in a city with a Democratic government do in a red state, a city with a Republican governor? What do they need to know? What are the considerations for small cities versus large metropolises versus a county or even a state? How can a jurisdiction move from a resolution to an ordinance? So each of these toolkits will be accessible by and tagged by a number of different factors. Next slide, please. In addition to the Knowledge Center, we intend to build a machine-readable data set with a number of indicators. And build is really not the right word, it is more collect. So we're looking for data about the circumstances, and this is what you'll see on the left, circumstances under which CEDAW was passed. And on the right, data about the ordinance itself. And so we... You can mute, please, that'd be great. So some of the circumstances and context which may be helpful to researchers, and again, these will be determined by the Data Governance Committee, but possible indicators might be whether it's an ordinance or resolution, the status of that ordinance or resolution, and the length of time that it has lingered in that status, the date it was initiated, the date it was signed, its location, jurisdiction size, the political environment and conditions under which it was passed, and partnerships and coalitions. And then Mary brought forward some great examples of the ways in which CEDAW ordinances are different. And so it would also be useful to be able to really dive into those details. So what is the scope of the ordinance? Is it looking at the jurisdiction as an employer, or is it looking at the community beyond? What are the data points and indicators that the gender lens analysis is seeking to address? What are the recommended actions? What are enforcement policies within those ordinances? And who is on the oversight committee? Next slide, please. Finally, we see an opportunity for jurisdictions who have enacted CEDAW to publish the data sets gathered as a result of their gender lens analysis. And because it will be on this open data portal, through CCAN, that data will be licensed and will be governed by policies put forth by the Data Governance Committee. We see this as a way to increase accessibility of gender data across the United States, as well as generate momentum. There's an element of FOMO. What did San Francisco do, or what did Washington, D.C. do? So there's a way, this is also a form of sharing knowledge and generating momentum for the movement. Last slide, please. Oh, next slide, please. Okay, and lastly, what is the project status? So we are in the early stages of this project. We are looking to convene our Data Governance Committee. And from there, we will be talking about the policies and guidelines to guide the research. We will then be going in and gathering our data sets, conducting research and data modeling, followed by the design and build phase, and then returning to the community for testing and engagement, and followed by launch. So we are very much at the beginning and very excited about partnering with Women's Intercultural Network and the Cities for CEDAW Advisory Board, and as well as wonderful support and insights from Institute for Women's Policy Research. And I'm going to turn it over back to Elizabeth for a discussion of implications of this project. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And so I'd love to just start to dive in again to what some of the points that you all brought up, and how they might be implicated in some of the great work that other people on this call are doing. Mary, I just wanted to put my first question to you. You mentioned about an oversight body as an essential mechanism of CEDAW. How does an oversight body allow the ordinance to remain dynamic and keep pace with the evolving gender discourse?
Right. So there are two oversight bodies that I think we've touched on. One is the UN committee that oversees and supervises compliance with CEDAW on the global scale. And they meet in Geneva several times a year and issue important guidance that keeps the treaty fresh and, up to date with evolving gender discourses. So there's that oversight body. And I do encourage all local decision makers who are implementing CEDAW ordinances to periodically check the guidance of that expert committee for ideas, for insights on gender justice, for best practices, etc. However, there's also an oversight body built into CEDAW programs that are established by the local measures that are passed in connection with Cities for CEDAW. Those oversight bodies they really vary. They really run the gamut in terms of their composition. Some of them are composed strictly of government employees. That can pose some problems with respect to, governmental capture, right? Like they can't have the independence that you may want in certain situations, or to look at the local government, objectively as you'd like. Some of those oversight bodies are entirely external, but they have run into challenges with respect to making sure that their recommendations align with the realities and practicalities of the local government, right? Because they're outside of it. And then some jurisdictions have sort of a hybrid model where some members of the oversight body are from the government itself, and some are external observers. So that just gives you some sort of background. With respect to data collection, that is the body that would be doing and sort of supervising the collection and analysis of data and making sure it moves forward. And, you know, as you mentioned, CEDAW measures are passed in a moment of time. Some of them are 10 years old, right? San Francisco's. And so they do keep the ordinance fresh by, you know, identifying new challenges that come up, identifying new lenses. Like some of the original CEDAW ordinances were not explicitly intersectional, and I think oversight bodies have done a great job on the whole of applying an intersectional lens nonetheless, although of course we want it to be in the text. That's just one example. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you, Mary. It definitely is. My next question is for Sarah, again, kind of around this idea around the data governance committee for this project. Tell us a little bit more about the types of decisions the committee would make for the portal. And again, it's this idea behind the governance committee is something, especially when you're thinking about something that could seem as I want to say very technical. It seems like, why would you need this type of oversight, this type of people dynamism in a data collection portal? You could talk to us a little bit more about that.
Thank you. Yes, so the data governance committee will be, first of all, determining at this early stage, determining what the movement would like to see from the data. And so these are really decisions that, from a technical standpoint, I don't have the expertise to know. My expertise is in implementation as opposed to driving strategy or driving the policy. The other piece of this is for security and for security considerations and privacy considerations. And so we want to ensure that this data portal is representative and that it is enabling, it is in service of communities as opposed to in surveillance of communities, for example. And there's an excellent question from Soon Young, who said, could you please talk about security and how you can control data manipulation and safeguards against inputs of data by anti-feminist groups? And so the structure that we're choosing to build this on, CCAN, is a data portal or data management system that is used by governments. And so all of the data is tracked through through metadata. And so we can see changes, any changes to the data. It's also licensed through open data fair use policies. And the data governance committee would be setting standards for how data should be submitted to the portal, what data is acceptable, as well as some oversight into what is published or not. So the data would be accessible to everyone there. And so as jurisdictions are submitting data, it would be important to remember that the data would be accessible. And so it should be submitted to the portal in a way that would not expose anyone to undue risk. I hope that answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are really important considerations, and seem like it's also a really important thing at all stages of the design and project and implementation piece. And it also speaks to some values, right? It goes back to the values of working with community and again, not being extractive. Robin, would you, this next question is for you. Would you mind sharing a little bit more about how something like this, a portal like this, a tool like this could be useful in the work that IWPR does?
Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, it would be extremely helpful. It is our hope at IWPR that opportunities to compare data across state and localities will spur further policy change for women. Later this year, IWPR is rolling out this updated version of our Status of Women in the States data dashboard, and I think I mentioned it earlier about the dashboard, which will provide state-by-state data on key indicators across women's lives. The data in the dashboard will be tied to policy solutions and will be this interactive tool that will allow state policy stakeholders to compare their states to comparable states. we are very excited for an opportunity to link that state level work we're doing through the Status of the Women Project to the local data collected efforts organized through Women's Intercultural Network, WFN's collaborative, and Cities for CEDAW open data portal. Especially since a portal like this that allows users to use, document, publish, and share data sets sounds robust and very rich in information. I hope that answered it.
Yes, thank you. You shared a little bit more about the challenges that exist in data collection. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how something like this data portal might be useful for the data, for the government piece of the government data collection that you mentioned. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Useful or just some of the challenges? I'll say I'm going to tie the use and the challenges back to something. I'll first answer. I think I was looking in the chats, and I think Jane Colvin asked me a question, so I'll ask that regarding where we get our equal pay data, and then I'll tie that into that answer. And I think I mentioned that we use secondary data analysis, and that it's good that we have a government that collects all this data, and so that data comes from government surveys from the the Bureau of Labor or Census Bureau, mostly household surveys, community survey, the American Community Survey, and the Current Population Survey, and some published outright. Sometimes we use micro data analysis. But what I wanted to say why I was bringing that up is because, as I mentioned earlier, the sample size issues limit how detailed we can go geographically. And that's why such a portal like this would be great. But speaking of challenges to something like this, where you're talking about collecting primary data, ideally as researchers, we love to design and collect our own data. And because then we can decide like what information is gathered, how it's gathered, and so forth. However, collecting primary data is very time consuming, it's resource intensive, and sometimes expensive. And then in addition, privacy is a big concern with collecting data from individuals. And I know that, Sarah brought that up. Sometimes asking those demographic questions can cause less people to complete the study. There are some types of information that people might feel uncomfortable providing depending on who is doing the research and what the privacy protections are. So as researchers, and this is important to the governance committee for this portal, is that we have to ensure that the data is secure, that we have privacy policies in place, and that participants, and this is extremely important, are informed about how the information will be used, shared, and controlled. And so that information sharing is essential because you want to gain the trust of the participants. And as Mary mentioned earlier, one big issue that has also become more important than ever is, particularly in this post-Dobbs United States, is privacy around gender data that includes any information on reproductive status. Regressive states' laws and crackdowns on reproductive freedom force us to have serious conversations about, let's be honest, who we want collecting, storing, and using data on reproduction.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. Mary, I can come back to you because you were so instrumental in the Los Angeles County CEDAW ordinance. What data about the CEDAW ordinance in the US would be helpful for you as you're thinking about what a refresh or keeping that dynamic would look like?
Sorry, just so I understand the question, what data from
what data about other CEDAW ordinances in the US would be helpful to you in the work you're doing?
With respect to LA?
Yeah.
Sorry, did someone say something else? Okay. Yeah, so this project really is at a fledgling stage, and I actually think this is a wonderful time to be having this panel because we would love input from all of the attendees about how to structure this, including what issue areas to identify that we want to collect data on. I want to highlight, I'm sort of going to a little bit sidestep your question here, because I want to highlight that that this is really a holistic process. We being Cities for CEDAW are not just getting whatever the local governments give us, because we have points of contact and intervention along the way, right? So we help them craft the measures that then dictate the data process. We also serve as sort of informal advisors along the process of passing the ordinance and then implementing the ordinance. So we have these opportunities to persuade the local government to do various things with respect to data. And so it's sort of coming full circle. So with respect to privacy, for example, we need to think about not just how our portal is going to protect privacy, but how we're going to try to ensure that the governments themselves are implementing the most stringent privacy safeguards they can, because, you know, it makes me extra nervous that it's governmental entities collecting this data. And it's not just reproductive health issues. It's, you know, if we want to know more about, if we want to disaggregate data along the lines of migrant status, like I think a lot of people don't want to talk about that. And if we do get that data, we want to be very careful with it. So varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but I can think of a few where it's incredibly dangerous. And so all of those considerations come into play at each stage of this process. And so I'm just going to sort of flip it around and ask, what key issues should we be paying attention to with respect to the data? I saw in the chat that someone was looking into the gender gap in political leadership, and that's already collected by many CEDAW jurisdictions, I know. And as a sidebar, the CEDAW committee, the UN CEDAW committee, is actually developing a robust recommendation pertaining to how state governments can improve this issue. So it's a very hot issue right now, and that's one example that I would give, and that I would want to see us rally around and make sure that we're looking at that data and that local governments are providing us with that data.
Thank you so much. And I actually think that's probably a good segue in terms of turning it back around to see if we can open up to questions from the audience. Let's see. And I believe Sarah, who has the stack? Let's see for the okay, let's see. We have someone, Sathya?
Sathya, hi everyone. I'm Sathya. It's very dark where I am, so I won't put the camera on because I haven't switched the lights on yet. I actually work in data governance. That was my background in the corporate world. Now I've used those data superpowers for inclusion and equity work more corporately. I'm just really interested. So I live and work in the UK. I'm from Australia. I deal with a lot of big global corporate organizations. And what I think is really interesting is that this UN CEDAW, statement really implies the need for data to be collected intersectionally. And I'm just curious on two things. I know we've talked about the US, but are you seeing, do you think we're using this basis of CEDAW enough to actually normalize data collection on diversity characteristics just generally? Because I feel like all the barriers you face, it's also because it's just not that normalized. To your point that we can have laws, we can have statements, but it's about practices. So I just wondered, like, how do we kind of use this? Because I feel like not enough people, you know, I'm going to go into corporates and remind them of this and say, hey, the other member states, you know, we've got countries like France where they're scared to even ask people their race. But actually what I love about this statement is it puts intersectionality front and center of gender equity, saying, well, you can't do it without that. I know that was a bit waffly, but I just wonder how we're using that connection to the fact that we have this, how driving to normalize it more. And the second thing is, are you worried we might go backwards?
Regarding the worry about people going back and people not wanting to share or release information. I think that's always an issue you face as a researcher when you're collecting sensitive data. I can't speak on the CEDAW and the different cities because I think that's specific to those individuals who are involved with that. But I can say as a researcher in collecting primary research data, the more sensitive the information, the harder it's going to be to collect, and the more laws, as I mentioned, as it relates to reproductive health or restrictions, the harder that's going to be. And we're seeing that. I mean, we started seeing that ago when it came to just sexual identity, backlash and forth. People don't want to share it. Earlier than that, in the 90s, we were seeing it around race, because how race was used in identifying and weaponizing and so forth. And so I can imagine that will continue to happen unless we see some changes in the political and social environment. So yes, to the question at the end, we will see, I think, some what I like to call apprehension in individuals wanting to share their data. And that was one of the reasons why I mentioned the importance to the governance committee about making it clear how the data is stored, controlled, used, particularly shared. That is essential when it comes to, because all of it's personal data. So it becomes to individuals, you know, putting that data out there. And also, let's keep in mind, most of the data, as I mentioned, is collected by government officials. And so there's also that kind of concern with trust of how it will be used later and so forth. So to that latter part, I can answer that. So I hope that answered some of your questions.
Thank you, Robin. I also wanted to wonder if any of the panelists want to talk a little bit about strategy as well. Because part of the issue around Cities for CEDAW is, you know, moving more cities to adopt CEDAW to begin with. And I know that there's a bit of a kind of a 1-2 strategy around adopting the ordinance, and then not really surprised because it's there, but also being like, and now you're actually obligated to collect the data, and maybe not necessarily putting that all up front, but kind of a bit of a strategic question around the approach there, if anyone wants to talk about that.
I can speak to that, but it looks like June Marie has her hand up.
Yes, I would just like to kind of state, and then this leads into what Dr. Robin Ellerby was just sharing, is that the way that these ordinances unfold, of course, each jurisdiction is different in their implementation and the way that they're structured, which is why it's super important for us to be having these conversations. But ideally, there's an independent body. Many of these cities and counties have coordinated with colleges and educational institutions and leveraged the research that's being done. They're not exactly doing the research, and so it's, the devil is always in the details, right? How are those relationships structured? How is this data fed into these mechanisms? And I think that's why it's incredibly important that we're doing this work thoughtfully and intentionally from the onset. But just, I wanted to point out that these are typically independent organizations, bodies, and each gender analysis is leveraged in different ways depending on where. And then the second part of that is with regard to passing CEDAW locally, the oversight body should be ideally members of the coalition so that the oversight body is somewhat independent of the government. So it's not like the chickens watching the hen house completely. And so I think, again, this goes back to how do we learn from what's been done, and how do we continue to push for ordinances that are both have greater efficacy, but that are also structured in the way that we think is most effective to ensure the privacy of these people of data, and helps to meet the ends that we're trying to do. So I just wanted to make that statement. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we had another question as well. Is this Nancy?
Oh, hello. This is Nancy Bermeau. I'm from Santa Clara County, which is in the heart of Silicon Valley. And I just wanted to echo what June Marie just mentioned and bring up a fact here. We recently had a full CEDAW ordinance adopted, which took, it was a long process. It took quite a number of years. But we do believe there's a way to shorten that process considerably. But what I wanted to say is we did, to June Marie's point, we reached out to our local law school here. Santa Clara University Law School has something called the International Human Rights Clinic. They were incredibly instrumental in working, partnering with the Commission on the Status of Women, advocating for CEDAW, providing legal expertise, and really working with us side by side with our county council as we developed the actual ordinance. We do, I do highly recommend if you have a law school nearby that you develop a relationship with them, find out which part of the law school is involved with human rights and gender issues, and bring them into the discussion, really helpful. So that was just my comment, but thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. And Mary, I thought you also were going to comment on the strategy, perhaps.
Sure. Yeah, I think I wanted to follow up on what Sarah referred to as FOMO. One strategic advantage of this project, I think, is that it will show who's doing what and who's not doing what. And in my advocacy with LA County, they were very concerned with what New York City was doing with respect to CEDAW. And every now and then I'd get a call from New York City's CEDAW task force asking, how are things going at LA County? And it was sort of a bit of a race, and I felt it was really galvanizing. And so I'm hoping that we put all this in, jurisdictions can see that they're being outdone, them to do better, whether it's getting something, whether they show up to the website and they don't have any CEDAW measure at all, and then they are galvanized to get going and pass one, or whether they need to turn their resolution into an ordinance so that it's more binding, or whether they need to do more data collection and implement more policies and protocols to address gender inequities. So we're hoping there's a strategic advantage there, but I think the sort of overarching strategic advantage that we're going for here, that maybe goes unsaid, but I think makes sense to mention, is that we need to, especially in this moment, we need to prove that there's gender injustice, right? Like, we need something to point to say unequivocally, here are these problems, because there's so much backlash saying there's no problem, right? Like, we're fine. What are they talking about? And when all the data collection is sort of disjointed or ad hoc, you don't get that same sense of critical mass around various issues. And I just want to follow up on June Marie's point about how jurisdictions currently are doing things so differently and really finding their individual ways, which is great. But I also think this process will help sort of normalize and find best practices across jurisdictions, and they can learn from each other and start doing things with common standards and common principles.
Thank you so much, Mary. Any other questions? Trying to look across here. If I don't see your hand, please feel free to just jump in. Nancy?
Oh, hi again. I just wanted to pick up on what Mary just mentioned about the FOMO. And I will say here in where I live in Northern California, we had a very similar situation where I'm within this large county. We were working on it on county level, and then the largest city in the county ended up adopting an ordinance. And so was a huge waste. If the city gets one done, then you move it to the county. If the county gets it done, then you move it to the city. We've done all sorts of things, including we've gone to a lot of the counties have city associations that all the mayors are members of. You can go to those associations and ask them to pass resolutions. Thereby, you spread it to all the mayors within a county. We're working on that right now in another county. And so once those mayors become accustomed to it, they learn about it, they sign off on it on the county association, they go back to their cities and want to get it done. And so it's very synergistic. And we're just seeing a lot of momentum building around it as we're seeing more with each county or each city, it just sort of mushrooms outward. So I just wanted to mention that. And we're doing everything we can to kind of help other jurisdictions get it done in our own and then take it to the next and the next and the next. And thank you again for this great session.
Thank you, Nancy. June.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to mention in terms of momentum that this summer there'll be the Conference of Mayors. And it was brought up yesterday in a strategic CEDAW session we had that if we can do something to uplift this work during this Conference of Mayors and highlight mayors that have really stepped up. This week during CEDAW, there will be a mayor acknowledged, which Gail and Elahe know, they could put it in the chat. But again, to try to kind of create that energy around the movement and to highlight the work that's being done in certain jurisdictions and how it's helping these communities and to hopefully then spur more momentum. So thank you.
The FOMO is real. It's real. It is a real motivator. Gail, looks like you, and then maybe after Gail, Dina.
Hello. Yes, I'm not in the best environment for quiet, but let me just comment that Women's Intercultural Network found this such a compelling initiative, and the reason we are supporting it and encouraging going ahead with it with all our effort and resources is because it's critical. It's not just a nice thing to have more data. It's not just a good thing to be more analytical in general and to offer back to our participants more information. The point is, it's really critical, and it emphasizes what Mary just said, which is that gender justice must be proven and documented over and over and over. We have had in my jurisdiction in Kansas City so much support for a resolution and then an ordinance. When we did our gender analysis, we were told, despite the disparities that show up in the analysis, there's really no problem here. Don't worry about it. That was shocking to us. We made them redo it. In fact, we insisted our coalition was strong enough to move it back to the consulting firm that did it. So my point is that the data is critical and the sharing of it and the analysis must be emphasized as leading to a greater goal of gender justice. So I'm so keen on this project and very glad that it's in such good hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. And I think that example you shared also really underlines the need not just for the data, but the network, the advocacy, the human component behind it that continues to compel the momentum forward as well. Dina?
Hi, everyone, and thank you for all the hard work. It's hard to listen, but also it's really a good thing to listen that we do not give up and we are keep moving. Quick question, is there any resistance that you have experienced in the cases that you wanted to sign by the counties or cities? And the second question is, do you have a kind of a procedure or kind of a blueprint if you want to do it? It is the first time I'm participating, invited by Ella, very much appreciate here. We are, for example, in East Bay, and we can actually, I know San Francisco signed, but we can double check to see which counties in our region didn't do that. And is there any blueprint to follow the steps? Thank you.
Anyone would like to jump in on that question?
Hi, this is Nancy again. I just wanted to say that we've worked on getting it adopted in our own county so extensively that we actually do have a working blueprint of how to do it. In terms of, we haven't put it up online yet, but I have everything. I have all the documents, the framework, the step-by-step, how we got the community engaged and involved, how we worked with the law school, how we put together the documents. And I am actively working, just FYI, in the East Bay with Alameda County. So Dina, if you're available, I would love to follow up with you after this. Just send me your contact info. Thank you.
Oh, that's so lovely, Nancy. And
We'd
the
love your
first
help.
question, that's awesome. I'm actually from Moraga, Contra Costa, but my next goal was Alameda to cover, but we have more. We can do Santa Cruz. We can cover
Yes.
the area for sure. But also,
Yes, and
the other
Contra
question
Costa
was,
too.
yeah, we need them. Yeah. Was there any resistance? Is there any kind of, history of maybe counties or cities who resisted this? And that would be another blueprint how to encounter those challenges.
Just a quick note on that. There are plenty of examples of that. And, we have, one of them actually is San Diego County. We will be talking about that in another session that's actually starting at 11:30 today on the adoption of CEDAW. But they encountered a tremendous amount of backlash, but they were successful in getting it done, and they did it in a record fast time. San Diego County is a place where they had no history of CEDAW, no resolutions, nothing, and they brought it about in less than 3 years. A full adoption, which they are now in the process of implementing. It's actually a thing of beauty, and would love to share more of that, but we do have examples of getting it done in difficult places.
Thank you, Nancy. Congratulations.
Just jumping in on that point, I know Elahe, Gail, and myself, many of us, the three of us, were at those council meetings as there was a tremendous amount of discussion around the definitions of gender and what would this look like, and a lot of community kind of irrational fear and pushback. And I know Mary was I think you got looped in on this, but our advisory council, and in particular Parisa, who I can't pronounce her last name, but she is on this council as well, and she is helping us to make sure that we're sharing the learnings across jurisdictions so that we can be prepared when we go into those meetings, because a lot of it is not founded based on facts, and so there's a lot of dispelling of myths, as well as just trying to counter the repressive right in the country, I guess, in a way. But anyway, thank you.
I'd also love to jump in here on these types of resources. are exactly what we would like to be presenting in the Knowledge Center, and to be accessible and filterable based on different types of characteristics. So how ordinances have passed and at what speed they passed in different types of cities, different size cities, different geographic areas within the United States, different types of coalitions that have come together. And so if you are a city and you're wanting to engage with this movement, you'll be able to get the resources that you need that perhaps most speak to your situation. And so that's one of the reasons why we are excited about this project, is building on the knowledge that Nancy brings and everyone on the Cities for CEDAW Advisory Board to move this to other places.
Can I just add something? I also just want to flag that I don't know that I think like speed is our #1 concern, even though there is an urgency, of course, to find ways to address gender injustices. But, you know, one provision Parisa and I built into the San Diego ordinance is an opportunity for local constituent input. And so we held a series of town halls, which, as June Marie and Nancy mentioned, were highly controversial. And but in the end, I think it was good to sort of air people's responses and misconceptions about CEDAW and create and build that buy-in, that local buy-in, because the hope is that then that translates into a more effective CEDAW program once it does get passed. So as much as we want to, you know, spread CEDAW everywhere, I do think it makes sense to stay rooted in local needs and local sort of zeitgeist, and ideally get the buy-in from local constituents.
Thank you for that, Mary. In fact, that's some of the things that we've encountered from our network, as well as people talking about, you know, as individual people will learn about the power of what this can mean for their community to adopt it, a full adoption. This kind of need to also, I want to say, not bring it from a place of socialize it, make it more so that individual people in the community also understand it and see what it is and see how important it is. So it's really also kind of the buy-in is really actually creating that constituency that one doesn't exist really. People aren't really necessarily opposed to it. They don't know about it.
Right.
And how people can, how they learn about it, and that approach is really, really important into building out longer term work.
And they can put pressure on the officials to really push it forward.
In many ways, we see this at WFN is, again, the reason why it's so ripe is that it's harder to have people unlearn negative ideas around it versus kind of a blank slate right now. So it is actually really ripe for us to be kind of the first messengers around what this is and how positive it can be. So again, it's really ripe for a very positive outcome. Okay, other questions, thoughts? I think I saw someone else's hand, but I'm looking.
I have one more question. Do you know about Canada? I didn't get that. I know we are talking about US, but is that adopted in Canada, accepted or not? Okay, thank you.
It is, I believe also is part of how there was some really exemplary investment around gender equity that happened in Canada because of, again, the opening up the mechanism by which to do that. If anyone wants to share more about that, it's the type of examples that could be on this portal as well.
Sorry, because it's international, I feel like I want to weigh in on that. So CEDAW, I mean, Canada is a party to CEDAW, the treaty, but oftentimes countries that have ratified the actual CEDAW still have that gap in terms of local implementation. And so actually a lot of local jurisdictions are looking at Cities for CEDAW in the US, ironically, because we haven't even ratified the treaty, to sort of learn lessons, see what local initiatives look like in terms of addressing gender justice. And so it's doubly important that we, invest in this effort, I think.
Yeah, and to that point, we were in a session yesterday with this, and we had representatives from the city of Taipei who have adopted a local CEDAW ordinance, and they have passed it at the national level. But as you mentioned, Mary, these are two entirely separate kinds of structures. So doing it at the local level means you've got buy-in from the local constituency, you've got a budget, you can implement, whereas where we've seen CEDAW kind of flounder a bit in many countries that have ratified it is that there is no accountability mechanism at that level. I mean, there is the accountability to report, but there's no teeth. Whereas when you're able to adopt this as a piece of legislation at the local level as an ordinance, then you can build in a budget, you can build in these gender analysis, make sure your gender analysis is funded. You can make sure that these, whether it's county departments like in Los Angeles, they've done it departmentally. Each department has to report out on their gender plan. So it becomes much more effective and much more accountable than even these national structures. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean Marie. It's so powerful, and really excited to spread the word, to spread the excitement, and to partner with everyone so that they can, again, get best practices, get the data, and also be, I want to say, first in the door in terms of building the constituency, building the messages, and how people understand this tremendous initiative and tool to move gender equity locally.
One more question,
also,
sorry.
Where
can we find the recorded meeting today? I love the data and everything. I would love to go through it one more time.
Sure.
Yeah.
Elahi or Sarah? I'm not sure where we might.
I think June Mary, hi everybody. I think June Mary is recording, and we are hoping to make it available on the site of Cities for CEDAW. Thank you.
Perfect. Sounds good.
Thank you so much. And we'll also be able to take the recording as well, and we'll have it on WFN's website as well, and social, so that others, even who were not able to join us today, can also learn and share it as well. Anyone on the panel want to make a final remark before we close out in the last minute?
I'm just so appreciative to be part of this project and to be learning about the Cities for CEDAW movement, and how we can bring it into this data portal. So I am excited about the work, and I am very appreciative of everyone here today. Thank you.
And I'll share that same sentiment. I'm excited. I'm very thankful about this session, for being asked to participate. I'm excited about this portal and the data that's going to be available, and how we at IWPR might be able to use it to, influence policy change. So thank you.
Right. Mary.
Thank you too. I'm really grateful to be here and to benefit from the expertise of my co-panelists. Thanks again for having me, and I'm really excited about this project.
All right, thank you again, everyone. Have a great rest of your week. We look forward to meeting you out in the world very soon, and we'll look forward to speaking to you next time. Thank you so much.